A functioning constitution determines the type of government under which one lives. The United States of America is neither a communistic state nor yet a one-church-dominated government. Why? Because of the Constitution. Now, to bring about either that the United States would become a communist government or that it would become a one-church-dominated government requires several things that could happen. It could be brought about by the overthrow of the present government by military means, or there could be a constitutional convention and the Constitution could be altered. But do you imagine or can you conceive of another way? Yes, that would be one way that would come in, but another way in relationship to the Constitution itself. That would be setting it aside. An emergency would set it aside. The Constitution itself, we could still say we're under the Constitution, but something else could happen. A reinterpreted Constitution. And on the side, we're rapidly reaching that point. And if we have a reinterpreted Constitution, are we in trouble? All right, now apply the same principles that we've talked about to prophecy. The same basic concepts apply. The prophecy can be the same that you've read over the years. It does not need to be thrown out. It does not need to be superseded. It does not be taken out of the way. All that has to do to change it is to reinterpret it. And you do not have the same prophetic truth that you once had. There are interpretations of Bible prophecy. And these interpretations of Bible prophecy are just as alien to each other as the forms of government we have used in illustration. The American, the communistic, or a one church-dominated government. They're just as anti to each other. And we can list them as the historistic, the preteristic, the futuristic, or the allegorical. Now let me go over those four categories again. And we'll be defining terms. Historistic, preteristic, futuristic, or allegorical. And it's going to be the objective of this first study, not only to define, but to give the meaning as to the method, as to which method of interpretation we shall use in the study of Daniel and why we shall use it. In other words, we're going to lay the groundwork upon which we're going to base these studies. And we're going to hold to it. And we're going to tell you why we're going to hold to this particular method. Now let us notice these schools of prophetic interpretation for a few moments. The allegorical, or we could call it also the symbolic idealism in the interpretation of prophecy. The allegorical. Now we are not immune as a people to any of these. The allegorical, or the symbolic idealism, has been defined this way. Prophecy is to be understood as purely a symbolic form of instruction regarding eternal truth about good and evil. Let me repeat that again. Prophecy is to be understood as purely a symbolic form of instruction regarding eternal truth about good and evil. In the latest issue of Spectrum, Volume 21, Number 3, in an article by Charles W. Teal, Jr., Professor of Christian Ethics in the School of Religion at La Sierra University, sets this forth as the ideal. Listen. Only as we tell the stories of these apocalyptic beasts in the present tense will contemporary Adventist young people consider appropriating Adventism's cosmic story as their story. For our sons and daughters who dream dreams and see visions, like the pioneers we hold them up to them, are not content to fight the beast of another time and place only, any more than John or Paul or Augustine or Peter Waldo or Martin Luther or William Miller or Uriah Smith were content to fight the beast of another generation. In fact, some beasts fought by remnant communities of a previous generation may no longer be bearing their fangs or have the strength to even gum their opponents into submission. To be faithful to the remnant message is not merely to fight the beast of those who have gone before, but to rename the beast under the pressure of every new generation. And how are they going to be renamed? Let me read you another paragraph. Babylonian realities in the Apocalypse, that's the book of Revelation, correspond to those institutions that give expression to the beastly, the manipulative, the coercive, and the corrosive dimensions of human behavior. Remnant realities are made up of the defenseless, the powerless, the vulnerable, the faithful, and the true. Forms of these expressions change, of course, but they manifest themselves in human history anew in every generation. What's it saying? All this is simply a social gospel robed in a prophetic unction. What's the remnant today? The defenseless, the powerless, the vulnerable, and of course the faithful and the true. Who's the beast? Those institutions that are beastly, coercive, corrosive. Every new generation interprets it in the symbolism of the times in which they live. The allegorical, the symbolic idealism, and this is being put forth in spectrum by a professor of Christian ethics in the School of Religion, La Sierra University. We are not immune to any avenue of prophetic interpretation. And when you change the interpretation, you alter the constitution of prophecy. And that needs to be realized. Let's go to the historistic. And I'm emphasizing the term historistic, or the historical, because we're going to come upon this word and it's not going to mean exactly as we thought it meant. This is the Protestant system of interpreting prophecy, or at least it's so been called. It defines history as but the response to the voice of prophecy. There is a continuity. Prophecy speaks to the past, the present, and the future. The historical. There's a scripture for that. Turn to Revelation 1:19. To John the statement was made by the one standing in the midst of the golden candlesticks. Write the things which thou hast seen, and the things which are, and the things which shall be hereafter. What's that? Past, present, and future. John was to write the things which thou hast seen, the things which are, and the things which shall be hereafter. Now why? Why is this threefold delineation given in the Bible for the interpretation and understanding of prophecy? Well, we find in 2 Peter 1:21, who gives prophecy? For prophecy came not in old time by the will of men, but holy men of God spake as they were moved by the Holy Spirit. The prophecy comes from God. We find in Revelation that God gave this revelation to Jesus to make known unto His servants the things which are to take place. Now this God of prophecy is revealed in prophecy in a very distinct way. Notice Revelation 1:8. I am Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the ending, saith the Lord, which is, which was, and which is to come, the Almighty. What is that? Is, was, and is to come. That's present, past, and future. That's the revelation of God in prophecy. Then should not the prophecy that He gives reveal and reflect Him? And it would be prophecy based upon a historical setting, past, present, and future. The historical method. This was indeed the Protestant hermeneutic and the presentation of the meaning of prophecy. In fact, by the means of prophecy so being interpreted, the Reformers fingered the papacy as the Antichrist, the harlot whore, and the man of sin. And they put the finger down so heavily and so forcibly that the Catholic Church reeled under the impact of prophecy. It got so emphatic and so pointed that Rome bestirred herself, and following the Council of Trent, in 550, the Council of Trent was 1545 to 1563, there arose two schools of prophetic interpretation, both schools developed by the Jesuits. We can talk about the Jesuits and Jesuit infiltration, but we must understand that Jesuitism can infiltrate through its own teachings. You don't have to have a Jesuit. All you have to have is a professed Adventist teaching Jesuitism. That's all you have to have. And these two schools of prophetic interpretation of the Jesuits was first the futuristic and then the preteristic. The futuristic school was invented or promoted by the Jesuit Ribera about 1580. And this concept that he developed was refined and enlarged by Cardinal Bellarmine. And interesting, this Cardinal, Clement VIII, when he made Robert Bellarmine a cardinal, said of him, "The Church of God has not his equal in learning." Remember this. In the contest over truth and error, those who stand for truth do not contend with idiots nor morons. They contend with the best minds of the Catholic Church and that the devil can bring onto the play to defend that position. This is no longer child's play in the matter of truth and error. And this is why we need to study and understand carefully these things of prophecy. The futuristic school of prophetic interpretation says that the major fulfillment of prophecy is future. All past prophecy stopped at the cross to be renewed again near the second advent in a future Antichrist. That's the general concept of it. They deny the year-day principle. Let me give you a summary of Cardinal Bellarmine's teachings in the Prophetic Faith of Our Fathers, Volume 2, page 500. I will read it. This is the statement on Revelation 13 and 17. Listen closely. Revelation 13 and 17, Bellarmine argues, both mention 10 kings who will be ruling over the earth when Antichrist comes, and assumes that both chapters limit his reign to a literal 3.5 years. Hence, both Daniel and John speak of but one single king and an individual that has not yet come. In supporting this contention, Bellarmine insists that the 1260 days of Daniel and John are but literal 3.5 years, a period that a single man can compass. As there is a difference of 30 days between the 1260 and the 1290, Bellarmine contends that Enoch and Elias, the two witnesses, will be slain 1 month before Antichrist is destroyed. Moreover, the difference between the 1290 and the 1335 days in Daniel 12 is seized upon as 45 literal days before the actual end of the world when Antichrist shall be slain. Thus, Bellarmine's long and tortuous argument on Antichrist all center on these two interdependent points. Antichrist's nature, a single man, and duration, a literal period of 3.5 years. Now, I've read you from this cardinal back there that came on the scene back there in the days of Clement VIII. But I think I have also read some things that we hear today. Right? Sadly. Where are those things coming from? Not from God, but from a Catholic cardinal. Maybe unwittingly, but nevertheless, actually. Now the preteristic. Alcazar, another Jesuit priest, in 1614, about 50 years later, finds that all prophecy is fulfilled in the past. Nero or some Antiochus Epiphanes, somebody in the past, that's the Antichrist. Can't be the Pope. Thus we find that there are two contradictory schools of prophetic interpretation from the same source with the same objective. The Jesuits don't care what it is, just so they get the job done no matter which direction they go. Today, the preteristic method of interpretation has been revived in the liberal theological sources emanating from Germany. Modernism. You can find this particular interpretation in some modern biblical, well, it's like an encyclopedia, what do you call it? The commentaries. You find it exposed there. And then, as if this is not enough, add to this confusion Dr. Desmond Ford's apotalismatic principle or theory. And we've got the thing well compounded. Let me just give you a little breakdown of Ford's position so that you understand it. This is from the book Daniel, published by the Southern Publishing Association when it was in existence. And this particular section of Dr. Ford's on pages 68 and 69 says this about the systems. He goes and defines the allegorical, the preteristic, the futuristic, and then he comes and says this. It must be said that each of the systems is right in what it affirms and wrong in what it denies. And he talks about how the situation with preterism, futurism, and the historical. And then he says this. If the apotalismatic principle were more widely understood, some differences between systems would be automatically resolved. In other words, if we can just take his principle, we can bring them all together, and we can compromise and come up with a thing between the Protestant and the Jesuits. That's not Daniel. Daniel had no gray areas. It was black or it was white. You didn't mingle it. Now, what is that apotalismatic concept of Ford? Let me illustrate it so that it can be very clear. Let's deal with the subject of the Antichrist. He goes back in the book of Daniel and says, that abomination of desolation, that Antichrist back there, to them, that was fulfilled in Antiochus Epiphanes. Now in the Christian period of the Middle Ages, that was again fulfilled in the papacy. And now we're going to have another fulfillment in the immediate future in a new Antichrist. See? Multiple fulfillments of the same prophecy, depending upon the time in which you live or live. He's got the past, as it were the present, and he's got the future. See, he's got it all together. Historical, but mixing them all together in a theory of prophetic interpretation. Now, why are these various schools of prophetic interpretation of vital concern to us today? Why are they of vital concern to us? This brings us to some history. And I'm going to throw a little bit in on the side. It is to be regretted today that history has been relegated almost to the back burner in our school curriculums due to the scientific emphasis and now the emphasis on computer science. History is considered dull and uninteresting. And this is sad. Cicero said, not to know what has transpired in times past is to ever remain a child. Today, there are too many children directing too many affairs. They do not understand the past. There are individuals today that are in American politics that do not know nothing about the heritage of America in the sacrifice of the Pilgrim Fathers and the Revolutionary War and all that went to make up our present Bill of Rights and the Constitution. They are historically illiterate. Children dominating the final scene. Ellen G. White herself has something to say about history. In Life Sketches, page 196, it says this. We have nothing to fear for the future, except we shall forget, as we shall forget the way the Lord has led us and His teaching in our past history. That's for the church history. Again, there's too many illiterates in church history. History is valuable and important and essential. Now I want to bring to your attention some dates and ask you some questions about it. What does 1831 mean to you? What does 1831 mean to you? That's a nice begging of the question. All right, 1831. Not exactly. And it's not exactly on that line. All right, let's just think about it. When did William Miller go public? 1831. He'd been studying for years and he went public in 1831. And what was the message? Christ is coming, and it's the basic message and the foundation of the Advent movement is involved there. Now let's go to another date. And you don't have to subtract or add to 1833. All right, the stars fell, and that gave impetus to the Millerite movement and the preaching of that message of the coming of the Lord. That great sign that pointed to the heavens and the things that were to transpire there. Now let's go to the date, 1844. Disappointment, but a fulfillment of the 2300 days. Now let's jump to 1863. All right, the organization of the church. The Seventh-day Adventist Church was organized in 1863. And then let me just ask you a question there. Between the 1844 and 1863, in the setting up of the Adventist Church in 1863, in the fundamental principles that were enunciated in the original statements of belief, how much of the Millerite movement did they accept and how much did they have to discard? Or did they discard any? 50%. 50% of the Millerite movement, they kept the 1844 and the time prophecy, but the fact of the sanctuary they had to what? Set aside. That between 1844 and 1863. Now, I'll give you another date. 1865. What about 1865? Or do I need to start calling names of the class? What? No, they had that before. Much before. Yes, but we won't get in that, Brother Peyton. All right, 1865 was the first edition of Uriah Smith's book on prophecy. Now, sadly, we have set Uriah Smith's work in concrete. Or we set it in concrete. Instead of adopting the counsel that we received, we set that work in concrete on the interpretation of prophecy. Let me read you the counsel that's been given. This is from Ellen G. White under date March 30th, 1897. Probably a manuscript or a letter. It says here, the Lord has made His people the repository of sacred truth. Upon every individual who has had the light of present truth. That means everyone in this room. No exception. Upon everyone who has had the light of present truth devolves the duty. What's a duty? That which is mandatory of developing that truth on a higher scale than it has hitherto been done. This is what our pioneers did. They accepted the present truth of William Miller. But did they stop and put it in concrete? They developed that truth to a higher scale than hitherto it had been done. And that's the responsibility that devolves upon every one of us in the study of prophecy and the truth that we have received. And if you have made no advancement or any advance in that, something wrong. I have it under the date of March 30th, 1897, but I do not have a letter or manuscript. I'm trying to find it, but I have it in a section that I have no quite question of its veracity. Now, some more history. About this same time, as we'll note, another counter-movement within Protestantism itself was set in motion, which has affected God's Advent movement. It began in England. It was an attempt to unprotestantize the Church of England and take it Romeward. Ritualism was reintroduced into the Church of England. Mysticism was also advocated. And the goals of this movement became known as the Oxford movement, or also called Tractarianism. A key leader in this movement was John H. Newman, described as the most brilliant and gifted son of the Church of England. Now, I'm emphasizing this again. Bellamy was recognized by Clement as the greatest gift to the Catholic Church as far as intellectual powers were concerned and what he developed. Now, here is Newman, recognized as the most brilliant and gifted son of the Church of England. We wrestle not against principalities and powers, but wicked spirits in heavenly places. We wrestle against heavy odds. And we need to recognize that. And the only way that we're going to be secured against that is to know the Word of God. All right, let me go on. He took a trip to Europe with a friend by the name of Froude. And in Rome, they made contact with the papacy. And they asked the papal authorities on what terms would Rome receive back into the fold the Church of England. The papal authorities said they must accept the Council of Trent. That was the condition. Hastily they left Rome. And Newman said as he left Rome, he says, I have a work to do in England. And on the way back by ship as he came from Italy into England, he wrote that hymn, Lead, kindly light, amid encircling gloom, lead thou me on. I used to think a lot of that hymn. The background of it leaves it in a little bit of a darkness. He had a work to do in England. And that year was 1833. As God was giving the impetus to the movement under Miller, which is the foundation of the Advent movement, the enemy was working in England. This movement lasted until 1845, when Newman left the Anglican Church to become a Roman Catholic, later to receive the Cardinal's cap. And this movement of Tractarianism, or the Oxford movement that Newman was the leading light, has affected Protestantism in two ways. It led to the Bible revisions to take the place of the King James Version. That's number one. And it gave emphasis to the futuristic school of prophetic interpretation into Protestant circles. Two forces. During this time, 90 tracts were written and circulated. That's how it got the name Tractarianism. These tracts were written on which emphasized the return to Romanism and its ritualism. However, tract number 83 was called the Advent Sermons on Antichrist. And this tract on Antichrist was presenting the Antichrist as future and his time as a literal 3.5 years. The roots of the present day struggle reach back to the very beginnings of the Advent movement. God began one, the enemy had his counterfeit, and the counterfeit, sadly, is almost overtaken, completely overwhelming what God had intended as the genuine. That's what? Right. 1848. All right. Now, not all of these tracts were written by Newman. Various members of the University of Oxford wrote them. Different tracts. But Newman not only wrote on the tracts, but he also wrote some articles. He wrote articles on prophecy. In 1840, he reviewed a discourse by Dr. James Todd under the title, The Protestant Idea of Antichrist. Now, Dr. James Todd, and I realize I'm bringing up new names that are probably not too familiar. Dr. James Todd, along with Samuel Maitland, William Berg, and John Darby of the Plymouth Brethren, revived futurism. And they disavowed the Reformation, calling it an unwarrantable schism. Now, see the forces that are at play. Now, Newman wrote a very favorable comment on John Todd's work. Then Maitland, one of the group, is the first Protestant to accept the teachings of the Jesuit Ribera. And in 1826, see the period of time? In 1826, just after, or just before, prior to Miller going public, in 1826, he wrote in his inquiry this. And let me read it to you in that inquiry. All right, this is what Maitland said. After much consideration, I feel convinced that the times and dividing of times of Daniel 7:25, times and a half of Daniel 7:7, times and a half of times of Revelation 12:14, 40 and 2 months Revelation 11:2 and 13:5, 1,203 days Revelation 11:3, are not mystical phrases relating to a period of 1,260 years, but according to their plain meaning denote a period of 1,260 natural days. Literal. This is the inception back into Protestantism at the very time the Advent movement was beginning, the Jesuit concept of prophetic interpretation known as futurism. Now let's do a little thinking. If the year-day principle is discarded, and that's what you take prophecy to make it literal time, 1,260 days, 1,260 years, year per day. All right, so if you discard the year-day principle, if the 69 weeks reach to the cross and the 70th week is a literal period at the end, what's left of the 2,300 days? What's left? Nothing. What's left of the Advent movement? Do I need to emphasize the fact that we are at a crisis in prophetic understanding and interpretation as far as the very basics of our faith are concerned? Not only does the Jesuit counterattack remove the finger of prophecy from the papacy, and thus hastens the Romeward trend in Protestantism, but it also destroys the prophetic basis of the Advent movement. We have no basis upon which to base the Advent movement. And this is why you start to flounder and you bring in this and you bring in that. You emphasize evangelicalism, you emphasize Pentecostalism, anything to get the Spirit because you have no prophetic basis. Now I would be both remiss and willfully negligent if I did not share with you the effect with this, which this conflict over prophetic interpretation has had on the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Among the Protestants who accepted and taught the futurism of the Jesuit Ribera was one, a John Darby. Now, John Darby originated the Plymouth Brethren Church. He took this futuristic scheme of the Jesuits and he added to it the secret rapture and dispensationalism. Now, that was not accepted by all the Plymouth Brethren. In fact, Dr. Desmond Ford tells us about this in the book Daniel on page 66. Let me read to you about what he says about John Darby. It was J.N. Darby, an earnest Christian lawyer, who had most to do with the development of that type of futurism, commonly called dispensationalism, which dominates Protestant fundamentalism today. In 1827, he entered that fellowship at Dublin, which later flowered at Plymouth in England and became known as the Brethren movement. The brethren included a number of remarkable leaders such as B.W. Newton and S.P. Tregelius, George Mueller and William Kelly, who were outstanding in piety and learning. Not all the brethren followed Darby in the idea of pre-tribulation secret rapture, but the group that did follow him became the most influential for the modern world scene. According to H.A. Ironside, Newton considered Mr. Darby's dispensational teaching as the height of speculative nonsense. Tregelius also dissented and left the brethren movement. The best or the most well-known of modern brethren, F. Bruce, is no partisan of Darby's. Now keep that in mind. He didn't go the extremes of Darby, but he's a Plymouth brethren, the most outstanding one of the present time, the late F. Bruce. Now here enters Ford. Bruce and the Plymouth brethren into the Seventh-day Adventist Church picture. That book, Daniel, published by the Southern Publishing Association, then in existence, by Desmond Ford, the preface of that book was written by F. Bruce. Let me read you what the preface says, the second paragraph. Listen closely to the very first sentence. In 1972, Dr. Ford was awarded the Manchester University degree of Ph.D. for his thesis on the abomination of desolation in biblical eschatology. What was Ford's dissertation? On the abomination of desolation in biblical eschatology. As befitted the purpose for which it was written, that work was controlled by the historical, critical method and was based on the primary exegesis of the biblical text, that is, the exegesis which endeavors to establish what the author meant and what the first readers understood or were intended to understand. The present work takes account of the primary sense, but moves beyond it to explore and set forth the plenary sense or the full sense. Now you notice here, he says that Ford used as a tool of interpretation the historical, that's CO-critical method. And we can say, Ford used the historical method of interpretation. So closely is the counterfeit going to resemble the truth that it's going to be difficult to distinguish between. This wording is deceiving. It's not the historical or the historistic interpretation. It's an entirely different one, but called historical critical. But notice the topic of the dissertation was the abomination of desolation. A copy of this dissertation was placed in the Avondale College Library. And some interesting researcher read that copy and published a little tract. Dr. Desmond Ford versus E.G. White on the vital subject of the man of sin. And this is what he copied out of that dissertation. We have also noticed, this is Ford on page 246 of his dissertation, we have also noticed that many things can be said with certainty regarding what the Antichrist is not. He is not a past personage. He belongs to the future and not to history. What's he saying? What interpretation? The historical? No. The historical critical. See the difference? Now, let's go on. What? Well, he brings in 1 John and defends himself. In a bygone polemical era, Protestants assumed this usage in 2 Thessalonians and thereby found an effective club to batter the papal Antichrist. This view, however, ignored not only the eschatological setting of 2 Thessalonians 2, but also the truth that the Christian church must cease to be such once the Antichrist becomes its tenant. Page 242. We have noticed also that the lawless one appears only at the end of time. Again, another page, 235. In the setting of 2 Thessalonians, Antichrist is not an individual to be manifest. No, in the setting of 2 Thessalonians 2, Antichrist is an individual to be manifested at the end of time. His parousia is a sign that the end has come. Therefore, any interpretation which applies this passage to an individual of past history or to a succession of such misses the mark. That is his dissertation by which he got his doctor's degree. Now, an interesting historical sidelight. The late Dr. Rue published this tract in the Lay Worker. Ford responded, Rue replied, Ford answered. Now let me give you that series of letters, and I won't read the whole thing, but I'll give you enough so that you can see what happened. This letter was written to Dr. Rue from Ford. Regarding the recent issue of the Lay Worker and its reference to myself, I would like to point out that the authors of that anonymous document you quoted have been labeled by the Australian Division as unethical and academically dishonest in their use of my thesis. Dr. Rue, I believe you are an honorable man who loves the Lord and therefore seeks only truth. Therefore, I offer you this opportunity of correcting the false impression you have unwittingly made in your publications. And he goes forth and sets forth and quotes Sister White in saying that she takes his position, and he uses various other references here. I believe that as an honest man, you will not let this misrepresentation go uncorrected, and wishing you the richest blessing, I remain yours, Desmond. All right, so Dr. Rue replies, Dear Dr. Ford, thank you for your confidence in my honesty. I trust that I would correct any misinformation that I publish. I have done so on several occasions. I'm sure you would not intend flattery. And he goes on to say, he said, these statements that you made, what do you mean by them? And he quotes them. Well, Dr. Ford responds, he says, thank you kindly for your reply. I appreciate your openness. In reply, you require the Antichrist of 2 Thessalonians 2, who comes with all power and signs and lying wonders, counterfeiting the parousia and revelation of Christ, has not yet appeared. The prophecy meets absolute fulfillment only in Satan's final deception. And then he quotes on 1 John 2:18, many antichrists have appeared. Yes, you can certainly believe Sister White, but I suggest you believe all she says on the topic, not just a few isolated fragments. Notice how the SDA commentary on 2 Thessalonians 2 have listed her application of Antichrist to Satan himself. Sincerely, Desmond Ford. Well, into this controversy as a result of this tract and what was published, Jorgensen of the Australian Division got into the act and wrote a letter to Bruce. And so Bruce replied, and I have a copy of that letter. He says, Dr. Jorgensen, thank you for your letter of November 13th regarding Dr. Desmond Ford. I'm glad to know that you're a friend of his, and so am I. And if any words from me can help him to face his criticize or his criticism, I shall be glad. It would never have occurred to me to classify Dr. Ford as a futurist, either in his PhD thesis or in his commentary on Daniel. As Dr. Ford himself remarks on page 66 of the commentary, I'm no partisan of Darby. I am in full agreement with Dr. Ford's criticism of futurism on that page. My own position regarding the interpretation of both Daniel and the Revelation is that commonly designated as contemporary historical. There's the word again. Contemporary historical. Well, you think he's right on line. Language is deceiving in this instance. And he goes on to say, I fail to see, but even if he were a futurist, I fail to see how this could reasonably be made as a ground for censure. Futurism is a perfectly reputable and orthodox option in the interpretation of biblical prophecy, although it is not the option preferred by Dr. Ford or myself. And he goes on to say that, in another one, that he appreciates his Catholic brother. I don't know where that is. I happen to have that. Well, I decided that I'd better write to him and find out what he meant by this historical, contemporary historical. So I addressed a letter to him over in Manchester, and I said in that letter, Dear Dr. Bruce, the letter which you sent to Mr. Alfred S. Jorgensen in Australia, dated November 25th, 1978, has come to my desk. In this letter you indicate that you consider yourself a contemporary historical interpreter of the prophecies of the books of Daniel and Revelation. In checking through the material available to me, I find the expression continuous historical used to describe one school of prophetic interpretation. But according to Merrill C. Tenney, in his book Interpreting Revelation, page 137, this is synonymous to the historistic view. I have read carefully the foreword which you have written in Dr. Ford's Daniel, and I note that you commend the historical critical method used by Dr. Ford. Is this approach what you mean when you designate your thinking as contemporary, historical? Dr. Bruce answered. And this is what he says, and listen closely. Thank you for your letter of June 17. I use the term contemporary historical in the sense given it by Charles, Studies in the Apocalypse, Edinburgh, 1913, to denote the view that the visions of the writer relate to contemporary events and to future events as arising out of these. That is, they relate to such first century events as the imperial persecution of Christians and the siege and fall of Jerusalem, and see in the events of the end time as a sequel to these. This is in contrast to the continuous historical view which interprets the visions in terms of Christian history through the subsequent centuries. He's saying, okay, all right, what happened in AD 70? Well, there's a sequel to that at the end time. See, an element of double application. Ford got around all of this by calling it the apotalismatic concept or theory. In 1898, Joseph Tanner, in his book Daniel and the Revelation, summarized this whole picture aptly. Let me read you briefly that summary. It is a matter of for deep regret that those who hold and advocate the futuristic system at the present day, Protestants as they are for the most part, are thus really playing into the hands of Rome and helping to screen the papacy from detection as the Antichrist. It has been well said that futurism tends to obliterate the brand put by the Holy Spirit upon popery. More especially is this to be deplored at a time when the papal Antichrist seems to be making an expiring effort to regain his former hold on men's minds. What's it saying? At the very hour when the papacy is in the ascendancy once more for its final flame, Protestantism has cut down its basis of defense. And sadly, that basis of defense has entered the Adventist community. The one mark of futurism, as given in the Seventh-day Adventist Bible Commentary, is this. A distinguishing mark of the futurist is that they believe in the coming of a personal Antichrist. Ford says, I'm no futurist, but I believe in a personal Antichrist coming. Somebody's telling the thing falsely. It's time to take a break. As we continue our seminar this morning, we're going to consider now Daniel, the second chapter. We're going to get into the basic prophecies of Daniel. And for you that are troubled over some of the historical and the aspects of the previous study, that would be a little more of certain depth, this will be a little simpler, and we'll get down to some of the basic issues as far as the prophecies are concerned. Let's notice the dream. Daniel, the second chapter, beginning with the 31st verse. Thou, O Daniel, sawest, and behold, a great image. This great image, whose brightness was excellent, stood before thee, and the form thereof was terrible. This image head was of fine gold, his breast and his arms of silver, his belly and his thighs of brass, his legs of iron, his feet part of iron and part of clay. Thou sawest till that a stone was cut out without hands, which smote the image upon his feet, that were of iron and clay, and brake them in pieces. Then was the iron, the clay, the brass, the silver, and the gold broken to pieces together, and became like the chaff of the summer's threshing floors. And the wind carried them away, that no place was found for them. And the stone that smote the image became a great mountain, and filled the whole earth. This is the dream. Now, this dream, while similar in sequence, it is nevertheless different from the dreams and visions given to Daniel himself. The dream is actually given in response to Nebuchadnezzar's desire to know the future. You'll observe that Daniel told him in the 29th verse, As for thee, O king, thy thoughts came into thy mind upon thy bed, what should come to pass hereafter, and he that revealeth secrets maketh known unto thee what shall come to pass. We also need to keep in mind that this particular dream was adapted to the mind of a pagan ruler.
We also must keep in mind that as far as Nebuchadnezzar is concerned,
It was not of the same nature in which Daniel was concerned about his people and their future.
turn to Jeremiah 20.
In other words, there's a different aspect to the dreams and visions that Daniel had against this basic vision that was given to this pagan ruler Nebuchadnezzar. We also must keep in mind that as far as Nebuchadnezzar is concerned, God speaks of him as my servant.
Behold, I will send and take all the families of
Turn to Jeremiah 25.
Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon.
Jeremiah 25, verse 9.
Jeremiah 27:6. And now I have given all these lands in the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, my servant.
Behold, I will send and take all the families of the north, saith the Lord, and King Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, and Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, my servant. Jeremiah 27:6. And now I have given all these lands into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, my servant. And in 43 verse 10.
God put forth every effort that he could besides bending the will of man.
And say unto them, Thus saith the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, Behold, I will send and take Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, my servant.
17th verse.
And when we note the book of Daniel itself, we find that God put forth every effort that he could besides bending the will of man
For the matter of Nebuchadnezzar. This matter
to bring Nebuchadnezzar to salvation. Turn to the 4th chapter of Daniel, and notice there in the 17th verse, God went so far as to call into counsel the angels over the matter of Nebuchadnezzar. This matter concerning the dream that he had in the 4th chapter is by the decree of the watchers and the demand of the word of the holy ones, to the intent that the living may know that the Most High ruleth in the kingdom of men, and giveth it to whomsoever he will, and setteth up over it the basest of men. Every provision that God could bring, and bringing in the council of angels and how they could work together to accomplish the thing, and the matter of what was going to be done to Nebuchadnezzar was concurred in by the angels, the watchers, the holy ones. And then the last recorded reference that you have of Nebuchadnezzar, as far as what he says, is there in the 37th verse. I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the King of heaven, all whose works are truth and his ways judgment, and those that walk in pride he is able to abase. And you and keep in mind, that's the simple formula of salvation. The provision has been made that when I come to this attitude, God can do something. And so God will. The last record we have is a confession of a contrite heart. God does not despise such. Now let's notice the interpretation of this dream. Back to Daniel 2. We will tell the interpretation, verse 36, we will tell the interpretation thereof before the king. Thou, king, art a king of kings, for the God of heaven hath given thee a kingdom, power, and strength, and glory. And wheresoever the children of men dwell, the beasts of the field and the fowls of the heaven, hath he given into thy hand, and hast made thee ruler over them all. Thou art this head of gold. And after thee shall arise another kingdom inferior to thee, and a third kingdom of brass, which shall bear rule over the earth. And the fourth kingdom shall be as strong as iron, forasmuch as the iron breaketh in pieces, and subdueth all things. And his iron that breaketh all things shall it break in pieces and bruise. And whereas thou sawest the feet and toes, part of potter's clay and part of iron, the kingdom shall be divided. For there shall be in it the strength of the iron, forasmuch as thou sawest the iron mixed with miry clay. And as the toes of the feet were part of iron and part of clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly broken. And whereas thou sawest iron mixed with miry clay, they shall mingle themselves with the seed of men, but they shall not cleave one to another, even as iron is not mixed with clay. And in the days of these kings shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom, which shall never be destroyed, and the kingdom shall not be left to other people, but it shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. For as much as thou sawest that the stone was cut out of the mountain without hands, and that it brake in pieces the iron, the brass, the clay, the silver, the gold, the great God hath made known to the king what shall come to pass hereafter, and the dream is certain, and the interpretation thereof sure. Now let me ask you a series of questions. Who gave to Nebuchadnezzar the vision? All right. God gave it. Who made known the interpretation of the vision? God through Daniel.
In other words, in the very first
What method of interpretation did God use?
in the Bible, as far as the prophetic
One after another would rise in the history of time. What do you call that? Historical.
is God's methodology of interpretation.
The Protestant. In other words, in the very first vision of prophecy that you have in the book of Daniel in the Bible, as far as the future is concerned for all time, God has given His method of prophetic interpretation, and that method is the Protestant historical method that we call it today. That is God's methodology of interpretation of prophecy. Therefore, we can conclude that in interpreting prophecy, that method that which God Himself has set forth, the interpretation thereof is sure, is the method is to be applied in the study of the book of Daniel and the book of Revelation in all prophecy. Here is the fundamental ABC in understanding prophecy. And interestingly, it's God.
Now let's just merely briefly interpret it. Babylon.
The same continuity, sequence governs all the prophecies that we shall note. There's a succession of 4 universal kingdoms. Thou art this head of gold. No question about the starting point. That was Babylon. And after these shall arise another kingdom, and another kingdom, and a 4th kingdom. Now let's just merely briefly interpret them. Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome. Now let me ask you another question. How long does Rome last? Till the end. Keep in mind that in this basic vision, the iron goes where? Clear to the toes. From the establishment of Rome to the very end, there is no ending until the stone kingdom.
But it doesn't make any difference. It's still Rome.
And this fact needs to be clearly understood.
Just because it may have changed its name a little bit, or
Pagan Rome?
it's still Rome. And it goes right to the end. And this is
But
the
Rome,
principle that you find in all the prophecies that we shall know. Is the little
this basic vision is telling you, as you compare it with the rest,
nondescript beast.
that it doesn't make any difference. It's still Rome.
The little horn is in that nondescript beast until we saw the
Just because it may have changed its name a little bit or its guise, it's still Rome. And it goes right to the end. And this is the same principle that you find in all the prophecies, as we shall note. Is the little horn ever plucked out of the nondescript beast?
the 8th chapter. The little horn of Daniel 8.
The little horn is in that nondescript beast until he saw the beast given to the flame.
Which is only pagan.
Don't forget, Rome continues to the end. And this is fundamental. And let's go one step further. In the 8th chapter, the little horn of Daniel 8.
We're dealing with the same power today
How do you represent it?
that the early Christians dealt with.
Is it only pagan?
We're dealing with the same power today that the Jews dealt with.
Or is it also papal? Both.
Let's not fool ourselves or exclude ourselves.
And this is a fundamental principle in the prophecies of Daniel that we have too often kind of cast aside and haven't paid attention to. We're dealing with the same power today that the early Christians dealt with. We're dealing with the same power today that the Jews dealt with. Let's not fool ourselves or exclude ourselves from history. It's still Rome. Well, never changed. Right. And that has a broader application than we've applied to it. The prophecy puts it right down the line. Now, I don't know whether the 2 legs represent the division or the division of the Roman Empire or the 2 phases. It doesn't make any difference. There's the 2, and it continues to the end. Side by side. The details are not broken down as far as the interpretation is concerned, but the aspect is there. You have the Eastern Roman Empire, the Western Roman Empire, but at the same time you also have pagan and papal. And that which pertains there too. And now let me call attention to a little bit that I said last night. I told you don't accuse me of double application. All right. Think. If it's Rome in two phases, the abomination of desolation can appear in the pagan phase, and the abomination of desolation can appear in the papal phase. And what appears is what would be called double application is not double application in the sense, but the prophecy itself permits the application under the phases. And that needs to be clarified and kept in mind as you study.
From the gold to the iron,
now at the ankles,
to the silver and the brass,
in the feet.
metal.
I think that's where the feet begin, isn't it? The ankles. All right, there it says there at the ankle the change takes place. Potter's clay is mingled with the iron. Now, notice as you think of this particular image, from the gold to the iron, through the silver and the brass, metal is used to symbolize kingdoms. Thou art this head of gold, and after thee shall arise another kingdom, and so forth and so on. And in all of these kingdoms, church and state are one. Pontifex Maximus, in other words, the church and state function as one. But now at the time of the ankles, there's some potter's clay comes into the picture. And at the time, and of course this is not implied here, the details, you go to the other chapter, the details, the deadly, in Revelation, the deadly wound, and you have the times, and we're going to note to get to the 7th chapter, but there was a change in the fortunes of the papal Rome in 1798. And at that very same time in 1798, there was another power arising here that what? Separated church and state. And that which was established on this shore finally became reflected back into the European picture where this whole picture and this whole setting is. And in that European section as it's reflected back, and there was separation of church and state, there was the weak and there was the strong. There was the mingling with the seeds of men. There was problems, there was trouble. We don't have to go into all that detail. History reveals it. And now it says something else. In the days of these kings shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom. These kings, when the God of heaven sets up a kingdom, cannot be the original 10 divisions of the Roman Empire. Even though Europe is pictured in that in a general way. Because what happened over there in the breakup of the Roman Empire was 3 of them. So that left 7. But here it speaks of the days of these kings and the 10 toes. All right, but there's the days of these kings. Well, yes and no, but wasn't they talking about the 10? Isn't they talking about a 10 aspect of 10 in the days of these kings, and it comes down to the feet? Well, now wait a minute. You come down to the feet. In there 10 toes at the feet? All right, then we come to the time of the feet. Okay, all right, Brother Payne. Let's go one step further. What's it say in Revelation 17 is going to be the ultimate number? Okay. 8? All right, okay. All right, let's get back now. Let's get back just for the 10 toes. Let's go in the days of these kings and so forth. Just as there's a picture here, at least down the feet. All right, the 10 divisions that are brought up in Revelation 17 come at what time? At the very end. Very end. That's the emphasis I want to put. The very end. And so we have that Rome comes into that play at the very end as far as the thing is concerned. Now, the stone kingdom. The stone is not of human origin. It's cut out of the mountain what? Without hands. No human origin, and so forth. And it hits the image at its what? At the feet. At the 10 toes. That's where it hits it. Now at the time that it hits it,
became a great mountain.
Notice what it says in verse 35 of the dream. Then was the iron, the clay, the brass, the silver, and the gold broken to pieces together, and became like the chaff of the summer's threshing floor, and the wind carried them away, and there was no place found for them. And the stone that smote the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. It hit it at its feet, and all was consumed at one time. All right, I see how you can draw that conclusion, but let's notice another possibility. Why not till then?
All right, what about?
Was Babylon in existence today? Well, just a minute. I'm talking about the kingdom. Is the kingdom of Persia in existence today? Now, wait a minute. What modern interpretation are you grabbing? All right. What about Greece? The kingdom of Greece. Of course, you have a state or a nation, but it says it's not a kingdom. Wait a minute. Is it a monarchy or is it a prime minister elected? Is it a functioning constitutional monarchy? Okay, like England then. What?
The first one was there. The second one took the place of the first. That kingdom, land made up the name, but its rulership as a Babylonian kingdom didn't exist. When Medo-Persia was finished, Greece was over. There was no Medo-Persian kingdom left. There might have been territory, there may have been cities. When we finished up, when Rome took over, there were no three kingdoms left.
Okay. All right, but it says the pictures of the prophecy, it puts them all together, doesn't it? It smashes them and grinds them at that time. All right, now let's think. Who chose the method of conveying the thought as far as this vision is concerned? God. What did He choose? An image of whom? Image of a man. An image of a man.
The reign of humanity.
To represent the kingdoms of this earth.
The reign of humanity.
When the stone hits the kingdom at the feet,
Principle that God tried to
the reign of humanity ceases.
It's God that sets up the reign.
When that stone hits the image at its feet, the reign of humanity. See, that's why I'm not particularly concerned with some of the details. The reign of humanity ceases. You see, the principle that God tried to get across to Nebuchadnezzar was that what? It's God that sets up the kingdom of power. He tried to bring Nebuchadnezzar out of his humanity concept and put him into the divine concept. The substitution of the human nature to become partakers of the divine nature. Humanity ceases and has to cease to rule in the lives of human beings if they're going to be translated. There's the ceasing of humanity and the human things in order that the divine might reign and rule. That's a New Testament concept that we aren't in on right now. Now we'll talk about a little further. Now the stone kingdom is the kingdom of glory. Kingdom of glory that fills the whole. Well, it'd have to be the kingdom of glory that filled the whole earth, wouldn't it? All right, now remember that. All right, remember that this dream was given to whom? A pagan ruler, right? A pagan ruler. All right, then is all the details that were applied. Well, tell me this: in the book of Daniel, even when you deal with Daniel 7, and when you deal with Daniel 8, the millennium doesn't come in until you get to what book? Revelation. All right, so you see the fuller concept is down here in the book of Revelation. You're getting certain basic principles here upon which you're... Well, isn't this agreeing that the ultimate kingdom is going to fill the whole earth as a stone? And all humanity reign is gone? Yeah, it's going to fill the whole earth. It's going to fill it. In what procession? No, all right. All right, okay, I can understand. I understand what you're meaning, but it's not. You're not particularly saying, as I see it, as far as the picture is concerned, is the stone filling the whole earth. The millennium is not in this picture. Where would you put the stone then? Are you going to have the feet go on into the millennium?
That which is future in the 20th chapter inject back into a simple outline of prophecy to a pagan king.
Humanity no longer rules of the second coming, do they? Now as the kingdoms of this world become the kingdoms of his crime?
When does that apply? At the beginning of the millennium or at the end of it?
Well, yes, but if you're going to take that which is future in the 20th chapter and inject back into a simple outline of prophecy to a pagan king, we're going to be in trouble.
Maybe those clay and the iron stay mixed up until the 1,000 years.
Well, if they do stay mixed up, they're going to be... Yes, but just a minute. They're going to be mixed up. They're going to be done on the earth for 1,000 years. All right. Now, let's look at it from another little angle. What is the difference in reason between the metallic kingdoms and the stone kingdom? What's the difference between them? It says the stone kingdom lasts forever and fills the whole earth. Now, what's the difference between the stone kingdom, basically in concept, and all these metal kingdoms? What? All right, why is one temporary and why are the group temporary and why is one eternal? Okay, all right, fine. Now you come back to the basic principle again. The ceasing of the rule of the human and the setting up of the divine. But let's think about it from just another little bit of angle. Every kingdom, gold, silver, brass, iron, was built on what? Force of arms. Human power. Human energy. The stone kingdom has its basis on another principle. God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. The principle of the stone kingdom is the principle of love divine. And we need to realize that in our own life experience, as simple as this outline is and what it's telling us, that there can be no successful Christian experience built upon human force. Force is of the enemy. The principle of true love, and I'm not talking about all this sentimental love that's being talked about on postage stamps, and which permeates the whole thinking of humanity today. The principle of love, the principle of the divine government. And that's why the stone kingdom will last forever. And only as you and I become subjects of the new principles, and the new principles govern our lives, will we be a part of that stone kingdom. Now again I say there are certain details we can probably have discussion over. This is a pretty broad outline of prophecy and there's very little detail in it. But there are those principles that you cannot deny. The metal, the clay, and the stone. And so let's keep that in mind. Now, do you have any questions that you want to ask about this besides what discussion we've already had?